Layla was the quiet wife, Samir the respected husband. But behind closed doors, a storm was brewing that would end in betrayal, disappearance, and death. Layla had always lived by the rules. Raised in a conservative Arab household nestled in a quiet, sun-drenched town near the edge of the desert, her life had been carefully shaped by tradition. From a young age, she was taught to be obedient, modest, and respectful. Her marriage to Samir, a successful local businessman, was arranged when she was just 22. By all appearances, it was a peaceful union. Samir provided well, respected her space, and was known in the community as a generous man. Together, they lived in a spacious home on the outskirts of town, surrounded by neighbors who valued family honor and order above all else. But beneath the calm surface of her life, Layla had always felt a quiet yearning. She moved through her days with a grace that made her the subject of admiration, but inside she was restless. Her world was small: household duties, family visits, community gatherings. She followed the expected rhythm, but it never felt like her own. There was a weight in her chest she couldn't describe, a constant sense that something was missing. That changed the day she first laid eyes on Zafar. Zafar was a purebred Arabian stallion kept at a stable just outside of town. Layla had gone there by chance, accompanying her younger cousin who had taken up riding lessons. While the instructor spoke with the child, Layla wandered through the open-air stables, drawn by the gentle sounds of hooves and the scent of hay and earth. And there he was, tall, muscular, powerful. Zafar stood apart from the other horses. His coat shimmered silver in the sunlight, and his eyes carried a strange intelligence, as though he understood far more than an animal should die in that moment. Something shifted in Layla. Her breath caught, her pulse quickened. She couldn't look away. It wasn't just his beauty. It was what he represented: wildness, power, a life unbound by rules. She began returning to the stable on her own, saying it helped her relax, that she enjoyed the peace. At first, no one questioned her. After all, horse riding was a respectable hobby. But Layla wasn't riding. She was watching, feeding, brushing. She spent hours with Zafar, speaking to him in whispers, running her hands through his mane, listening to the way he breathed as if he were her confidant. Over time, her visits grew longer and more frequent. She found excuses to leave the house, to escape the structure of her life for the silence of the stable. There, with Zafar, she felt free in a way she never had. Her heart, once buried under layers of expectation, began to stir with emotions she couldn't explain. He gave her a sense of connection she never felt with Samir. Unspoken, powerful, primal. But with obsession came secrecy. Layla stopped telling Samir where she was going. She became guarded, her phone always close, her routines shifting subtly. Samir noticed the change. His once gentle, easygoing wife now seemed distracted, even distant. Their dinners, once marked by soft conversation, turned quiet. When he asked where she had been, she offered simple answers with forced smiles. He didn't press, but his unease grew. Meanwhile, Layla's bond with Zafar deepened. She began caring for him personally, convincing the stable owner to let her take over grooming duties. It was rare for a woman to be so involved with a stallion. Arab culture often regarded such closeness with suspicion, but Layla didn't care. She felt alive when she was near him, her thoughts clearer, her mind untethered from the rules that had shaped her since girlhood. In the privacy of the stable, she began writing in a small journal, her thoughts poured out in secret. She wrote of feeling trapped, of dreams buried beneath duty, and of a connection to something she didn't understand but couldn't resist. Her words were intense, at times chaotic, yet filled with yearning. The journal became her second escape, one that carried all the emotion she couldn't share aloud. But in a small town, secrets rarely stay buried. The stable hands began talking. A few strange looks, unspoken questions. Rumors trickled into the community. A woman spending hours with a stallion. What was she doing? Why always alone? Whispers became louder, and suspicion turned into gossip. Samir heard fragments of it and dismissed them at first, unwilling to believe his wife could be at the center of such talk. But the unease remained. Something was unraveling, slowly and quietly. Layla had opened a door she couldn't close, a path that began with longing but was now leading somewhere darker. Her growing obsession, fueled by emotional isolation and unspoken rebellion, was pushing her further from the life she once knew. And while the town still saw her as the quiet, respectable wife, a storm was building in the shadows, one that no one would be able to stop. The gossip had started as faint murmurs, the kind that barely carried across coffee tables and market stalls. But in a town where people clung to tradition and guarded reputations like treasure, even a whisper could travel far. Layla's presence at the stables had not gone unnoticed. Women who once smiled at her began to exchange knowing glances. Some avoided her entirely. Men gave her quick, uncomfortable looks when she passed. The air around her began to shift, from warmth and familiarity to quiet suspicion. Still, Layla continued her visits. She told herself she didn't care what they thought. The connection she felt with Zafar was too strong, too consuming to walk away from. Her time at the stable was the only place she felt like herself. Away from judgment, away from the constant expectations. The horse responded to her like no other. He would trot toward her the moment she appeared, nuzzling her shoulder with an almost human sensitivity. She found comfort in the routine, brushing his coat, feeding him by hand, talking softly as if he could understand every word. The outside world faded when she was with him, but Layla wasn't as invisible as she believed. One of the younger stable hands, a teenager tasked with sweeping the barn and feeding the other animals, began watching her closely. He didn't mean harm at first, he was just curious. But as the days passed, what he saw disturbed him. The time she spent with Zafar wasn't like anything he had seen before. Her affection was intense, lingering. Her focus was unwavering. She rarely acknowledged anyone else. It was as if the horse was the center of her world. Eventually, the stable owner pulled her aside. He was kind but firm, telling her that her visits had to be reduced. Too many people were talking, and business was starting to suffer. He didn't accuse her of anything outright, but the message was clear. Layla was becoming a problem. That night, she sat in the dark of her bedroom, turning the stable's rejection over in her mind. She felt humiliated, then angry. The one place where she found peace was being taken from her, and she couldn't even explain why. Not to Samir, not to anyone. Samir had been watching quietly all along. At first, he chalked up Layla's absences to stress or boredom. But as the rumors grew louder and her behavior more distant, his doubt turned into paranoia. He followed her one afternoon, staying just far enough behind to remain unseen. He watched as she walked into the stable and disappeared into Zafar's stall. He stayed there for hours, waiting, his hands clenched, his thoughts racing. When she finally emerged, her face looked calm, almost euphoric. Samir said nothing that night, but something inside him broke. In his world, a wife's loyalty was sacred. Her obedience, her modesty, her role, they were not just expectations, but foundations of honor. To think she might be crossing those boundaries, and with an animal no less, filled him with shame and fury. But he had no proof, no hard evidence, only a storm of emotions that he buried deep behind a stoic expression. Layla noticed the change. Samir became colder, quieter. He stopped asking where she was going or what she was doing. But his silence wasn't indifference. It was something far more dangerous: calculation. He began asking subtle questions around town, pressing the stable staff for details, watching Layla's every move. What he discovered only deepened his suspicion. One of the stable boys mentioned that Zafar had become aggressive when anyone but Layla tried to approach him. Others whispered that she had once tried to sleep in the barn during a thunderstorm, refusing to leave the horse's side. The more Samir learned, the more convinced he became that something unnatural was happening. He didn't know what exactly, but he knew it had to end. His pride, his name, his standing in the community, they were all on the line. Layla's actions were tearing apart the carefully built image of their marriage. And whether it was love, madness, or something darker driving her, Samir was determined to put a stop to it. But Layla was too far gone to see what was coming. Her thoughts were consumed by Zafar. At night, she dreamed of the two of them running across endless dunes, away from everything and everyone. She no longer cared about appearances or consequences. She believed her connection with the horse was fated, a bond deeper than words. She didn't know that every step closer to Zafar was pulling her further into danger. What she thought was freedom was quickly becoming her undoing. And in the silence between them, something irreversible had already begun. The tension inside the Rahman household had become unbearable. Samir spoke less with each passing day, but his silence was louder than any words. He had started locking his phone, coming home late, and watching Layla with a cold, guarded stare. She tried to ignore it, pretending things were normal, but the atmosphere had changed. Meals were eaten in silence. Doors closed a little harder. The space between them, once bridged by habit and duty, now felt like a canyon. Layla buried herself even deeper into her routine with Zafar, refusing to acknowledge the unraveling threads of her marriage at the stables. The tone had shifted too. The stable owner was polite but distant. Staff avoided her eyes. She noticed. The conversations would stop when she entered the room. Zafar remained her only refuge. He was still responsive, still gentle under her touch, but even the horse seemed agitated at times. Some days, he refused to eat until she arrived. Other days, he kicked at the stall walls without warning. Layla convinced herself it was a reflection of her own emotions, both of them feeling trapped, both desperate to escape something they couldn't name. Samir, meanwhile, had begun taking steps behind the scenes. He visited a local private investigator under the cover of a business trip. He handed over cash and a list of questions. He didn't want just suspicions anymore. He wanted facts, photos, patterns, evidence. Within a week, he had them. Images of Layla brushing the horse tenderly, lingering far too long. Logs of how often she visited, how long she stayed. One report mentioned she had once stayed after the stable had officially closed, convincing the staff to let her finish just one more chore. It wasn't illegal, but it wasn't innocent either. When Samir confronted her, it wasn't with anger. It was with cold clarity. He showed her the photos, the records, the patterns. Layla didn't deny them. She couldn't. But her reaction shocked him. She wasn't afraid. She didn't beg or explain. She looked at the papers with distant eyes and calmly told him he didn't understand. That was the final blow for Samir. Not the photos, not the rumors, but her indifference. In his eyes, it confirmed everything. Layla had chosen the animal over her husband, over her dignity, over their life. The very next day, Zafar was gone. Layla arrived at the stables to find his stall empty. The gate was open, the hay untouched. The owner wouldn't meet her eyes when she asked where he was. Someone had taken the horse overnight. The locks weren't broken. No alarm had gone off. She screamed at them, demanding to know what happened, but they said nothing, just nervous glances and shrugged shoulders. That night, she returned home and confronted Samir. Again, he said nothing, just stared at her until she walked away, her heart pounding with dread. For the first time, Layla felt real fear. Not fear of being caught or judged, but fear of loss. Zafar was more than a horse to her. He was her escape, her secret, her freedom. And now he was gone. She couldn't sleep. She paced the house, called the stables, asked neighbors. No one had seen him. She checked nearby farms and even wandered the outskirts of the desert. There was nothing, not even tracks. It was as if he had vanished from the earth. A few days later, a stable hand contacted her anonymously. He told her Zafar had been sold, quietly, without records, to a buyer outside the region. No paperwork, no trace. The horse had been taken, away in the middle of the night under Samir's instructions. It was swift, deliberate, and irreversible. Layla collapsed when she heard. She stayed in bed for 2 days, refusing food, barely speaking. Her body remained still, but her mind raced. She imagined Zafar in unfamiliar hands, mistreated, confused. Her connection with him had been severed by force, and she felt as though a part of her had been stolen. On the third day, she got out of bed. Her eyes were hollow but steady. She began making a plan. Not loud, not violent, but focused. She started gathering money from the house, selling off small jewelry pieces for cash, preparing quietly. Samir didn't notice. He was too satisfied with the outcome, thinking he had won, thinking the threat was over. But Layla was no longer grieving. She was transforming. Something inside her had changed. It wasn't just about Zafar anymore. It was about control, about freedom, about reclaiming what had been taken from her again and again, by society, by expectation, by her husband. And while Samir returned to his routines, thinking order had been restored, he didn't realize that Layla's silence had become something else entirely. It was no longer retreat. It was preparation. The calm before the storm had arrived. In the days following Zafar's disappearance, Layla operated in silence. Her movements were slow and deliberate, masking the storm that churned inside her. On the surface, she returned to her routines, cleaning, preparing meals, answering neighbors with tight smiles. But underneath the calm, she was watching, listening, calculating. Each night, she would wait for Samir to fall asleep before slipping out of bed, tiptoeing to the living room, and opening her notebook. The entries she wrote were different now, less emotional, more focused. A blueprint for something irreversible was beginning to take shape. She had lost Zafar, and with him, she believed she had lost the last piece of herself that was free. But she wasn't going to let it end there. Samir had taken what she loved. He had crossed a line not even years of repression and obedience had dared to touch. Layla no longer saw her marriage as a binding contract, but as a cage. Every quiet dinner, every polite exchange, was a rehearsal for the final act. Samir had stolen the only thing that made her feel alive, and she would make sure he understood the cost of that betrayal. She began gathering information about his habits. When he left the house, when he returned, when he was distracted, what doors he locked. She studied him the way he had studied her, taking mental notes on his behavior. She noticed he had begun trusting her again, believing that with Zafar gone, her fixation had ended. The lack of tension in the house gave him a false sense of control. He didn't see the quiet revenge building in front of him. Late one afternoon, Layla visited the local hardware store, pretending to shop for household supplies. She picked up rope, gloves, and a small utility knife, all tucked carefully into a fabric bag. She told the cashier they were for gardening. No one questioned her. She was still, in the eyes of the community, just the quiet wife. Harmless, invisible. She used this perception to her advantage. The nights grew darker. Her dreams became fragmented, full of blurred images of Zafar running, Samir shouting, the desert swallowing everything. She barely slept, but when she did, she woke with clenched fists and a racing heart. She no longer feared what she was becoming. She welcomed it. The quiet, obedient girl she once was had vanished the moment Zafar's stall was emptied. What remained was someone sharper, colder, and fully aware of the price of silence. Then came the night she had prepared for. Samir had stayed late at a friend's gathering. Layla knew he would return half-drunk, tired, careless. She waited in the dark, sitting perfectly still in the kitchen, her breathing slow and controlled. When he arrived just after midnight, he dropped his keys on the table and went to wash his face. That was when she moved. No hesitation, No second thoughts. She followed him silently, her footsteps lost beneath the hum of the house. In the moments that followed, there was no chaos, no yelling. It happened with eerie efficiency. The rope, the knife, the gloves, each used exactly as she had imagined. Samir didn't have time to react. His eyes met hers only once, and in them, she saw confusion, then realization, then nothing. When it was done, she sat down on the floor beside his body, her hands trembling not with fear, but with release. For the first time in months, her thoughts were quiet. She didn't run. She cleaned the scene slowly, methodically. She knew enough from the books she had read to avoid obvious mistakes. She dragged his body to the car, wrapped in a blanket, and drove into the night, toward the desert. The same desert where Zafar had once run free. There, under the moonlight, she buried Samir in a shallow grave, covering it with stones and sand. No one would find him easily. The desert kept its secrets. She returned home just before sunrise, washed the dirt from her hands, and burned the clothes she wore. By the time the neighbors awoke, she was outside watering the plants, the same quiet figure they always knew. When asked about Samir's absence, she said he had left on business. Days passed, then a week. No one questioned it. Samir was known to travel often. Layla smiled through it all, but inside, she was already rewriting the story. She wasn't the victim anymore. She wasn't the wife waiting in silence. She had made a choice. A brutal one. A permanent one. The town still whispered about her past, about the horse, about the strange tension that once lived in her home. But they didn't know the truth. Only the desert did. And it wasn't talking point. 2 weeks passed, and still, no one had questioned Samir's disappearance. Layla maintained the story that he had traveled for business, using vague destinations and excuses that fit his lifestyle. The town accepted it without much suspicion. Samir had often gone away without notice. His distant personality had made it easy for Layla to explain his absence. If anyone found it strange that she seemed calm, they didn't say so. She smiled at neighbors, hosted tea with relatives, and went to the market like nothing had changed. It was the performance of her life, and she played the part flawlessly. Inside the house, things were quiet. Layla had removed all traces of Samir's presence. His clothes were packed away, his cologne tossed in the trash, his photos tucked into a box in the attic. Every reminder of him was erased as if he had never lived there. She found peace in the silence. For the first time, she could move through her home without watching her words or steps. She could sleep without fear. She no longer woke to the weight of his suspicion or the quiet judgment in his eyes. The air itself felt lighter, freer. Yet, something in Layla had shifted. The act of taking Samir's life had severed more than just her marriage. It had broken a barrier inside her mind, a threshold of what she believed she was capable of. She no longer saw herself as the same woman, the one who once felt small, restrained, voiceless. That person was gone. What remained was someone who had chosen her own path, however dark it had been. Still, consequences have a way of catching up, even when the world seems quiet. One morning, Layla received a phone call from a man who introduced himself as a private investigator. He claimed to have been hired by one of Samir's business partners who hadn't heard from him in over a week. The man said it wasn't urgent yet, just a routine check, and asked if Samir had contacted her. Layla kept her voice steady, told him Samir had left in a hurry and hadn't said when he'd be back. The investigator thanked her and hung up, but Layla knew the call meant something had shifted. Someone was looking. Someone was asking questions. She didn't panic, but she became more cautious. She checked her surroundings more often, watched cars passing by, paid attention to faces she didn't recognize. Her calm surface began to ripple. Then, a few days later, the local police came to her door. Two officers, polite but firm, asked to come inside. They told her they were conducting a welfare check after Samir's business associate reported him missing. Layla invited them in, offered tea, and answered their questions with practiced ease. She told them he had left abruptly, that he had been stressed about work and needed time. She handed them an old business card of his and gave them a contact number that she knew no longer worked. The officers asked to look around. She allowed them. They found nothing unusual. As they left, one of them paused at the door and mentioned something offhandedly, that Samir's car hadn't been seen at the airport or in the city, that it was strange for someone to vanish without a trace. Layla smiled and said maybe he didn't want to be found. They left without pressing further, but their eyes lingered too long on her face. She felt the first sting of real fear since the night she buried Samir. Layla knew she had to be ready. She began planning again, not for escape, but for control. She reviewed every detail, every possible weakness in her story. She created emails from Samir's old account, sent messages to his contacts to give the illusion of life. She posted on his social media, carefully copying his tone. It worked, for now, but the pressure built slowly. She began to see shadows that weren't there. Cars she didn't recognize parked too long on the street. Her hands shook when the phone rang. Her dreams grew darker. Sometimes, she would wake in the night and imagine Samir standing in the corner of the room, silently watching her. Then, one morning, she returned to the stables. Zafar was not there. But she walked through the empty aisles slowly, touching the wooden beams, breathing in the dust. This was where it all began. Her escape, her downfall, her awakening. She stood in the stall where he used to be, closed her eyes, and tried to remember the way it felt when she first met him. The sense of freedom, the thrill of something untamed. That feeling had vanished. She no longer knew if what she had done was about love or madness. Maybe both. Maybe neither. But it was done. The man was gone. The horse was gone. And all that remained was the silence of the stable and the weight of what she carried with her. As she stepped out into the sun, the sky was blinding. The world looked the same, but nothing in her would ever be the same again. She walked slowly down the suburban street, her shadow long behind her. Somewhere, the truth waited to be uncovered. But not today. Today, she was still free.